Welcome to everyone with us today and those of you joining us via our recording. We have one question posted this week, and it relates to a patient who presented with social anxiety. He had beliefs like, I must always give the best performance. Now he feels better and is asking for self-confidence materials, articles, and exercises. My question is, should I follow this agenda? And if so, what resources could I advise him to read or to work with? So maybe we'll start at the beginning here. This patient may have some self-defeating beliefs, like I must always give the best performance. And I could see that related to I must do my best, or I must do better than other people. The social anxiety part would probably be more the latter. I must be the fairest of them all. And if I'm not, I'm the ugly duckling, something like that. So the most upstream part of the trouble that I have identified is this concept of a separate self, which is a construct. It's a cognitive construct, and all of us have it. It's that me that is distinct from you and from everything else. So when this construct gets activated, it's not always activated, but when it gets activated, there are certain brain structures that correlate with that. And we might get very invested in this imaginal creature, me. I looked at some research on narcissistic personality disorder this week. And in fMRI studies, people who meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder will look at pictures of themselves and feel distress. And parts of the brain light up that would light up if someone were experiencing an aversive event of some kind. Whereas people who wouldn't meet the criteria for this disorder would not have those parts of the brain light up. So this might be an extreme example of someone who's terribly committed to an image of themselves. And if in their eyes, or in their perception of other people's eyes, that self falls short of being the best, being the fairest of them all, and so forth, this will trigger extreme distress. So, to recap, all of us have this mechanism, we might call it egoity, identifying with an ego that is separate from others and from the world at large. And it's our relationship to that construct that gives it the emotional meaning that it would have. So if we start with the patient who feels that he must do the best, must be the best, must distinguish himself, his separate self, from the other separate selves that he perceives around him in a way that shines its halo so that he compares favorably with other people. Of course, the other side of that is that other people would compare unfavorably with himself. So there's always an element of hostility in identification with ego. We're promoting ourselves and demoting others. Now, this mechanism comes with anxiety because even though we may perceive ourselves as being the fairest of them all, that can change in a heartbeat. So when we're committed to being the best, being the fairest, we're living in a very precarious position. In any moment, the tables can turn, and when they turn, someone else is going to be in the position of being honored or envied or admired or something. And we're going to be in the one down position. So typically, and I think this might be the case with Philip's patient, people will present for help because they find the anxiety that travels with this construct aversive. So Philip was saying initially this person was presenting with social anxiety. And social anxiety would, of course, be a flavor of this mechanism, comparing ourselves with others. So when they're asking for help being less anxious, you can probably see how if we limit ourselves to addressing the negative thoughts that travel with the construct, this will not be a satisfying resolution. Because even though a person might defeat a thought, I'm not as good as that person. If the construct stays in place, that thought will be back. And they would have to defeat it like 8 billion times for every human being on the planet at this time. And of course, then there'd be more people born. So there's no way to win if we're trying to do cognitive therapy that limits itself to the negative thoughts that arise from this construct. I've already said a lot, so let me stop there. And before I go on, see if there are questions or comments on what I've said so far.
This is just amazing. It's exactly what I wanted to hear about today. And I didn't even put in the question.
I have these telepathic powers that no one else on the planet has, no one else in the universe has, actually. And I can see into the brains of other human beings. It's a lot of fun to channel our inner narcissist from time to time. Yeah. And I'm happy to hear, Patricia, that this is what it was that you wanted to have addressed. It's not surprising to me because this is a dimension in which I struggle. It's a dimension in which you struggle. It's a dimension in which every human being I've ever met who talks to me in an honest way struggles. We get ourselves wrapped around this axle of fearing others' judgments, which at the end of the day is actually fearing our own judgment. Let me unpack that a bit as a next step here. If we have a negative thought, that person is better than me. And we're fearing that thought in the other person's brain. I think we see this a lot on social media. there's this perception of how the mob is perceiving us. And people will kill themselves if they believe that the mob is perceiving them in a hostile way. Adolescent girls are particularly vulnerable here. The suicide rates for, I think it's girls 14 to 19, have increased something like 100% in the last 5 years. And certainly COVID has something to do with that. But people who are looking at it are saying social media has even more to do with it. That 24/7 now, we can see how we're doing or see who's judging us by picking up a phone. So anytime we fear the judgment of the mob, oh, they've turned on me. They're now telling each other and posting on the internet what a loser I am. The starting point is we have that thought about ourselves. So we will never fear a critical or hostile thought in someone else's brain unless we have already attacked ourselves with that thought. And here I think the thought shades over into self-defeating belief. A thought is something that comes up in the moment in response to a trigger and then goes away. So the thought might be, Patricia doesn't like me. Or Patricia left the class early. Patricia thinks I don't know what I'm talking about. It's very tied to the moment. And once Patricia leaves, I may worry about the thought for a while, but then I'll move on and find something else to worry about. A self-defeating belief is much more global. And in this case, it might be a belief I'm not a good enough teacher. I just walk around 24/7 knowing I've set myself up as a teacher of CBT, but actually I don't know what I'm talking about. So it's that self-defeating belief, which might be related to Philip's patient belief, I must always do the best or be my best or be better than other people or something like that, that gets triggered by something like Patricia leaving the class and then produces the negative thought that would be the proximal cause of the anxiety. Typically, our self-defeating beliefs are not the cause of anxiety. They're the soil from which the thoughts that drive anxiety arise. So if we notice that we're feeling socially anxious or professionally anxious, interpersonally anxious, and don't want to feel that way, the place that we can really get traction is at the level of belief. And typically it takes a little uncovering to get to the belief. So the socially anxious person might present and say, yes, I felt highly anxious, and these were the thoughts I had. But unless we can get to the soil of those thoughts, I don't think we can help the person walk away from social anxiety. Because so long as the soil is there, the thoughts will be back. And of course, at the end of the day, to relieve ourselves of all anxiety, we go one step further upstream and learn to de-identify from that sense of a separate self. Because when we're no longer separate, there's no fear. All of the great world religious traditions have talked about this. When we see clearly the way things really are, we're not afraid. Living and dying, it's all good. But when we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, it's that realm of belief that I try to get to as soon as possible. We'll identify negative thoughts and write them down, but I keep going. Where are these coming from? And I've done this enough, and I've had enough self-defeating beliefs and negative thoughts that get triggered from them, that I am a pretty good guesser. Someone gives me a couple of negative thoughts, I can start to sniff out what that belief is. And at the end of the day, for Karen Horney, the belief is always a self-rejection. I should be someone different. I should not look like I look, sound like I sound, think like I think, have the emotions that I have, and so forth. We haven't yet gotten into the nuts and bolts of methods or agenda setting and so forth, but I wanted to conceptualize this before we did anything else. And I'd love to hear from you all if this conceptualization resonates with you, or if you'd see things somewhat differently when it comes to anxiety.
This is so awesome. It's like bringing tears to my eyes. Yeah. Going back to self-esteem, I've read a blog post by Dr. Burns about the self-esteem ladder, like going from conditional self-esteem to unconditional self-esteem, and then you can go to the no self to no self. Like once you have self-esteem, then you can let it go. And I kind of wish you could jump from conditional to no self. So it makes me think about the question that Philip brought from his client about building self-esteem. Like, is that essential? Or can we just skip it?
I think you put your finger on probably the most human point here, Patricia. Albert Ellis talked about USA, unconditional self-acceptance. And he believed USA was the universal solvent for human emotional suffering. And I would agree with that construct. I have been studying Zen for 50 years now. And everyone that I have studied with has said you cannot study Zen without an ego. And the more psychologically minded teachers that I've studied with have said you can't make progress in Zen without a very strong ego. So some of my fellow travelers on the Zen front, particularly as younger people in their 20s, say, spend a lot of time meditating and nothing changed. And later on, they realized they were trying to avoid feelings of anxiety or feelings of depression or PTSD symptoms. There's a phenomena called spiritual bypassing that refers to this path. Instead of addressing my suffering, the historical, cognitive, behavioral roots of PTSD, anxiety, depression, I'm just going to sit and it's all going to fall away. I have a patient currently who's in the process of leaving a very fundamental religious group, who anytime he talks with about an extensive trauma and addiction history, they tell him, why are you talking about this? You are a new creation in Christ. And this was very confusing to him for years. But as he's developed and grown, he's realized he's outgrown that construct. He's no longer interested in spiritual bypassing. He wants to dig in and get to the root of his trauma and his addiction and change his thinking, his behavior, his emotions, his ways of relating to other people. He's doing magnificent work on that front. This is long work. This doesn't happen overnight. So, per my points of reference, we need a robust sense of self to break through that sense of self. Because if we don't have it, if we're not owning it, we're not saying, yes, this is me. This is not you. This is me. And in Zen practice, this relates to the Therapeutic Alliance, we could say, standing up to our teacher and saying, no, that's you. No, I see it this way. I disagree with you. I don't care who you are. This is me. It's an essential ingredient for progress on the Zen path. I think probably for any of the contemplative traditions. I also listen for that with my patients. If a patient is not ever disagreeing with me, I sniff a problem there. When a patient begins to be willing to disagree, to speak up, to say, no, I don't think so, Daniel. You seem very convinced about that, but I see it this way. That's music to my ears, because I think now the therapy is having an effect. Now this person's able and willing to stand on their own 2 feet and speak to authority, speak truth to power. They have the truth, I am the power. They're going to tell me what their truth is. So I think also on the spiritual path, it's almost certain that when we first put our feet on that path, we will long to avoid the work. We'll just want to have one experience and then be free of suffering for all time. I spoke to one of my teachers about this for an article in East West Journal I wrote back when I was a New Zen student in the 1980s. And Willige said, oh yeah, particularly in the West, not so much in China and Japan, but in the West, there's this idea that you can take a pill and be better. And so people come to Zen practice thinking, oh, I'm going to have one experience and life will be great. No more suffering for me. And then he laughed. And then he referenced Jung and said, but that's not the way it works. This is an individuation process. It's a Jungian term. We have to make our own the perennial wisdom. And that is a lifelong work. So if we go a contemplative path successfully, we will have these moments where we realize, oh, I thought there was something wrong. And now I see it's all been right down to the bottom, right from the beginning. It's all been just right. And then we lose sight of that and we get wrapped back around the axle. So the way of enlightenment is a life path. We put our feet on it and it never ends. They say the Buddha's still practicing and he's only halfway there. So I would agree, if we want to progress on the way of liberation, we have to cultivate and own a very resilient sense of ourselves as a separate being. Only then do we have something solid to step off from into a larger human awareness.
Can you talk about self-esteem?
Absolutely. So when we're identified with a separate self, we're in a precarious position. Reminds me of the Zen story of this hermit who lived in the top of a tree. He never came down. The wind would blow, and he'd go back and forth. He was just up in his tree. And he became known as a wise person. So people would come to the bottom of the tree and ask him stuff, and he'd talk to them, and the word of his fame spread. And finally, the emperor asked him to come, but he wouldn't come down out of the tree. So the emperor and his retinue made the journey and arrived at the base of the tree. And the emperor looked up and said, "Oh, hermit, you look very precarious up there." And the hermit looked down and said, "Oh, emperor, you look very precarious down there." So maybe being the emperor of China is like the most esteemed separate self one could have. You have a lot of people esteeming you, and the emperor probably had a tremendous sense of self-worth. It was obvious to himself and to everyone around him that he was the most important being in the universe. I don't know what brought him to the tree. The story doesn't say that. But oftentimes, even emperors have this inkling that this too shall pass. And if their security is located in reifying the esteem of a separate self, that has a shelf life. So while self-esteem at the end of the day is a security operation, it's protecting something that will go away. It's like building a sand wall around a sandcastle by the seashore. It's big business. A lot of money to be made in the self-esteem business. Or as another of my Zen teachers called it, the self-aggrandizement business. So at the end of the day, I'm not interested in self-esteem for those reasons. Sometimes self-esteem is set up as the opposite of worthlessness. And we're given a false dichotomy. We'll either feel bad about our separate self, or we'll feel great about our separate self. And people who are feeling bad about their separate self may come to us and say, "Help me feel better about my separate self. Help me esteem my separate self." Per our conversation earlier, they may be laying out a road that they would want to take, and I would encourage them to take it, to consolidate a robust sense of separate self, to know clearly and vibrantly who they are and who they aren't. Now, that's not about esteeming something. That's about being clear about something and no longer denigrating something. So my understanding of what I would want to offer someone who tells me they're suffering from low self-esteem is a vibrant acceptance and appreciation of who and how they are, which, if they come into, will extend to all beings. This is the mark of genuine self-acceptance. We not only value, protect, treasure our unique presentation of the way things are, we equally value and protect every other. This takes us out of the realm of being one up or one down or better than or best or worse or all of that stuff. This takes us into the realm that I would call reality. Now we're living in the way things really are, where one being's not above another being or below it or more valuable than or anything like that. These are all human constructs that arise and I think at the end of the day drive the horror that we see being enacted on the global stage all around us.
Thinking of it that way helps answer the question of, or make the question moot of how much self-esteem is enough.
Exactly. It takes us out of the realm of gradation and puts us in the realm of reality. My Rottweiler does a great job of living in the realm of reality. He moves through the world very confidently. He knows who and how he is and presents that moment to moment to moment to anyone who's interested. Never hedging his bets, never trying to put his best paw forward or something like that. Philip, I'd love to hear what's coming up for you as we're, again, talking in a very high order way about your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I was listening and making notes. I'm glad that Patricia liked this topic too. So that's good. And thank you, Daniel, for all these brilliant comments. And I this separate self is something that I feel is really important here. I think I need some more time to understand it like 100% and how can I use it with this patient and kind of help him to achieve acceptance and really feel good with who he is. Yeah, it seems very important here, and I look at him a little bit like this kind of person that you talked about that are practicing Zen because they feel something is wrong in their lives maybe, so this would be like an instant cure for them. And I think he's asking me sometimes for solutions. Yeah, I will do meditation, I will do exercise, I will change my one negative thought. I'm prepared to do it, but give me this and give me the solution. And sometimes I'm happy that he's making progress, and he says I look at his results and they are better, and he seems fine. But then he asked me, I have low self-esteem. I need more self-confidence. Give me a book or something. I'm prepared to deal with it, but I start to think about self-defeating beliefs, about is it really what he needs at the moment? What is he talking about? Again, yeah. So it makes me think what should I do? So one question that stays in my mind with this particular patient, because I don't know if I explained correctly, problems. But the question that I'm still wondering is how should I deal with his attitude of asking me to give him like exercise on being more self-confident, for example. Yeah, how to, if I should, give it to him if I find something, or I should maybe do some agenda setting or something else.
I really appreciate your intelligence around this point, Philip. So when you told me that the patient is asking for articles and exercises to increase self-confidence, I had the same question. Let me unpack this a little bit. So the patient is suffering. He's saying he's suffering from a lack of self-confidence. My sense is if we got more granular, we'd hear that when he's around other people, he's paying attention to negative thoughts that originate in his brain and which he's projecting into other people's brains. So he would like to dial down or to eliminate that suffering. Per what we've said so far, you can probably see, I don't see that as a problem of self-confidence. Paradoxically, we could say it's a problem of being too self-absorbed, having too much identification with a separate sense of self. So a project to have him even more focused on himself would not be something that I would see would help him, because he's living in a state of self-rejection. And he's saying, Philip, help me be a different human being. Believing that if he becomes someone else, his low self-esteem or his lack of self-confidence will be resolved. But I think you can see we'd just be throwing gas on the fire. That's his problem, that he's rejecting this magnificent, perfect, precious presentation of the way things really are, which is exactly him, exactly here and now. So we could approach this in a couple of ways. One would be to open this conversation with him and see if he could understand what Karen Horney was pointing to when she said, as soon as we create another fiction, our first fiction is a separate self. As soon as we create the next fiction, the ideal self, that self who's not socially anxious, that self who is confident, and so forth. we create a third entity, the despised self, which is who we are right here, right now. And because this is a law of physics, this is just the way it works. As soon as we make a commitment to the second fiction, to the ideal, we will suffer. And we may enlist therapists or self-aggrandizement industrialists in this vainglorious pursuit and say, if we work really hard, I can be somebody different. So if he could understand that, and in addition to understanding it, accept, yeah, that's a law of nature. As soon as I commit to the second fiction, I will suffer, and I will suffer eternally. It's like if I hit myself in the head with a stick, it will hurt. It will hurt eternally. That's just the way we are. It's the way things are. And so that is not the road forward. Then I think doors start to open. And they open in the direction of this person practicing an appreciation of himself exactly as he is here and now. And then the whole methods cabinet opens for us. I suspect Carol has some ideas in this direction. I'll mention one that I oftentimes assign to people for homework, and that is self-disclosure. Instead of hiding that despised self and trying to present the idealized self, we can practice appreciation for who and how we are by describing it to other people. And we can do this anywhere, anytime, with any human being or animal. Doesn't need to be a human being. A number of my patients talk to their pets about this. Say, "Pet, I'm feeling really down on myself right now." And the people with cats seem to report the cats seem somewhat indifferent. But people with dogs tell me the dogs tilt their heads and their eyes widen, and they're very empathic listeners when we tell them that we're feeling bad about ourselves. I'm writing a book about this currently. There's a lot of neuroscience that would help us understand what's going on there. But when we disclose who we really are to another being, we'll only do that if we are in a place of acceptance of that being. It's a kind of litmus test. We may say, I accept myself in some dimension, but unless we are willing to go public and make public statements about that aspect of self, I don't believe we are in a place of acceptance. So it can be a high-speed way to break through some of the barriers that are chaining us to one of two fictions, the separate self fiction or the idealized self fiction, and present ourselves in the real world as we really are. Carol, what comes to mind for you when we talk about the method section of moving from identification with irreality to an appreciation and presentation of the way things really are?
As you were describing the self-disclosure, I thought, oh yeah, I love that one for anxious patients and people who are comparing themselves to others. And you do when we use that tool to find the self-defeating belief, that's usually a good strategy to use with them, is for them to own up to how they really feel about themselves or what they really struggle with to another human being. And I've seen the kind of gates blow open there. And I was thinking of how you called the protecting of one's ego or the outsourcing as a security operation. I just love that that analogy, running this security operation as if it's actually working. And the other way to blow up the security operation is to do the shame attacking exercises, especially if they can do a shame attacking that's relevant to their specific self-defeating belief or thought, or right, like I wish I could give an example, but like if they're worried about making a fool of themselves in front of their class, they're a professor and they're worried about somehow screwing up and making a fool of themselves. Well, that's exactly what they need to go do, is purposely make a fool of themselves, right? Be befuddled or purposely give out the wrong information or start with the wrong lesson or whatever it might be, and wait for the class to correct them, right? And then they'll discover that people are more concerned or want to be more helpful rather than judging and rejecting them, right? But along these lines, Daniel, I had a question. Like, if somebody does have a full-blown narcissistic personality disorder and they're coming with the anxiety that's secondary to, their fear of their being rejected, being found out that they're not all that, right? Would it even work? Like, would they, can you even get them to, can you get a narcissist to not be a narcissist if it's a full-blown personality disorder?
Think of Kohut's work in this direction. I think the analytic tradition, psychodynamic tradition, has a lot more time in the saddle on this front. And per Kohut, the starting point is the Therapeutic Alliance. So there are various flavors of narcissistic personality. And there's a debate in the literature now that centers on to what extent is a sense of grandiosity freestanding. It just, some people are very grandiose. And to what extent is it the grandiosity is security operation for a sense of insecurity or low self-esteem, not being good enough? So there's no kind of consensus that I have seen in the field currently on this point. But my guess is that there's all kinds of flavors out there. And my guess is that a person who meets the diagnostic criteria for NPD and presents to therapy probably has that more vulnerable flavor. And it's that more vulnerable, we could say more real sense of self. For the patient, it might be the despised sense of themselves that would be amenable to creating a therapeutic alliance and actually doing psychotherapy. So the starting point, as I would see it, wouldn't be like doing CBT unless we include in that cultivating for months or years an authentic human relationship with this human being. Now, in the course of doing that, we're going to be doing some imaginal exposure. So before asking any patient whether they have grandiose features or not, to go out into the world and do self-disclosure, say, I'm going to invite them first to do that with me. And I always see it as a huge step forward when a patient is willing to be more of who they really are in a session with me and to disclose information that they have been holding back, probably because they fear being judged and rejected by me. And whenever patient takes that step forward, I spend a lot of time appreciating, thanking, admiring them for their courage to be more of who they really are with me. So when we're talking about a person who's tremendously self-referenced, whether we use the term grandiose or narcissistic or something, they're all wrapped around that axle wheel of a separate self and probably tremendously invested in having that self rank above other selves and have that ranking above be noticed and commented on, be admired, have lots of thumbs up on social media, that sort of thing. I would look first to what's happening in our relationship with each other before I would expect or believe that much else different could happen for them outside of the therapy itself. And that's simply my take on it. I imagine there's lots of different takes. Wonder if others have experience in this direction or thoughts about agenda setting and narcissism.
It does make sense that maybe the person that has narcissistic traits or milder personality disorder, if they're willing to show up to therapy to get help for their anxiety, they may be more amenable to change, right? To doing that hard work. And the full-blown narcissistic person is not going to show up to therapy, right? This is pretty much how they're going to operate the rest of their lives. And I do think that social media is, like you mentioned, I'm guessing that a lot of these influencers are struggling with this, issue, right? Of kind of outsourcing their relevance, and their self-approval is based on, do others approve? And they tend to be the ones that you do hear about committing suicide or something. They have some falling out of grace, or their self-doubts get the best of them because they've got people attacking them on Twitter or X or whatever it's called. And I do think that a lot of younger people, like you said, especially the teenagers, are very vulnerable to this phenomenon of having this huge audience.
Thanks to you all for our time together here today. I've deeply appreciated our conversation in the direction of human wellness and acceptance of reality, walking away from commitments to irreality that come up moment to moment for all of us. In Zen, we say, greed, hatred, and ignorance rise endlessly. This is the nature of the mind. Our negative thoughts come up moment to moment to moment. And this becomes a vow when we add, and I vow to abandon them.